Good afternoon and welcome. I am so delighted to have all of you join us today to learn more about Indiana's wetlands. My name is Dr. Sarah McMillan. I am a wetland scientist and an engineer here at Purdue University. To get us started, I have a few announcements. First off, I really want to just thank those of some great staff and folks at Purdue Center for the Environment, especially Robbie Tees, for helping organize, promote, and run today's event. This event is really central to the work of our Water Challenges group within the center, which I'm the leader of. And I would just like to really thank also our external partners, particularly Hoosier Environmental Council and the White River Alliance, for all of their hard work that's supporting not only this event, but environmental concerns around the state. Please note, we are recording this event. Many of you have asked about that. We're going to post the first part of our session on the Center for the Environment website, probably up in the next couple days. And then the second part of our discussion will be posted on Hoosier Environmental Council's website. The event is also being live streamed on Facebook, so you should have a link in the email. If you get kicked off for some reason or you get disconnected and unable to join, Purdue Center for the Environment Facebook is available. You can also just Google the Purdue Center for the Environment, our main page there, and you should be able to get to it from there. And then like was mentioned on the website and everything else, after this science discussion where we've got faculty and researchers joining, we hope that you'll stay online to learn more about the policy implications for the Indiana Senate Bill 389. That policy forum is hosted by Hoosier Environmental Council and the White River Alliance, and they will be recording that event as well. So I just really want to let you all know how excited we are for this opportunity to learn and think about more about the value of Indiana wetlands. But it's really also a time to advance discussion of these important issues around the state. So not just us talking at you, but a two-way dialogue. So to do so, it's really difficult with a large group like this. So we've got a few things going to do so. Each speaker is going to have 10 minutes today, and then we're going to try to address 1 to 2 questions after the presentation. So if you have a question you would like to ask one of our speakers, please post it in the Zoom chat. We've also set up a Slack workspace for this discussion, and the link is also in the Zoom chat. If you have not joined Slack already, jump on over while you're in the middle of this, and you can post questions there. We're going to be monitoring both of these throughout the event today. And the main reason for the Slack is that we recognize we might not get to all the questions, and we want to make sure that we have time to continue this conversation as best we can. So as I mentioned, I'm a wetland scientist myself, and my own research focuses on water quality. I work in wetlands, but also in streams and rivers and floodplains. I'm joined today by researchers from across Indiana who are shown here on this slide. They're all doing some really groundbreaking work on the dynamic and diverse wetland ecosystems that we have in Indiana. So let me go ahead and get started with a statistic. 85% of wetlands that were present in the state of Indiana when it became a state 200 years ago have been lost. And these wetlands are currently at risk, as proposed legislation would allow for the filling or draining of these state regulated wetlands. And these are being called isolated wetlands in the popular press and in the legislation and text. And this will happen without any review. This puts about 80% of Indiana's remaining wetlands at risk. And many folks in Indiana may not know about these state wetlands and their roles in the ecosystem and how it functions. So we've brought together researchers who study the various aspects of wetlands to provide research-based information and help inform that discussion. So even though these at-risk wetlands are called isolated, they're really not. They're called that because they lack a direct surface water connection. But in reality, these wetlands are connected to groundwater, and many communities in Indiana actually rely on these for drinking water. They are also an important, they play an important role in trapping and filtering pollution that improves downstream water quality. They store water during heavy rain events, and that minimizes flooding not only in rural areas, but in urban areas as well. And they store an immense amount of carbon that would be released to the atmosphere if they were drained. They're also a critical habitat for many diverse species of birds and amphibians and other wildlife. So as you can see, these wetlands are critically important ecosystems. And to further elaborate on all the details and kind of highlight each of these different functions in turn, I'm going to start by turning it over to our first speaker, Dr. Chris Kraft.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
I'm going to introduce you really quickly. So Dr. Kraft is a professor at Indiana University. He's an ecologist with over 38 years of experience working in wetlands, and he's going to set the stage for us to understand the importance of isolated wetlands in the landscape. So take it away, Chris.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Don't you all just love technology? All right, so we're talk about isolated wetlands in terms of what they are, where they're found, and what sort of functions and services they provide. Well, they're found everywhere around the world. This is just a map of the lower 48 showing maybe the better known concentrations of isolated wetlands. And they would include things like Carolina Bays and Cypress Domes of the Southeast Coastal Plain, the prairie pothole region of the Northern Plains that goes up into Canada, very important waterfowl breeding area. The playas of the Southern Plains, which are important migratory stopover for migrating waterfowl, and anywhere in karst landscapes. What's not shown in here, except in California, where they protect their vernal pools, there's vernal pools everywhere, particularly in the Northeast US, not only in California, the northern parts of the Midwest, and actually here in Indiana. And of course, these are very small isolated wetlands. What do some of these look like? Well, this is a gum swamp from the Southeast US. They're just depressions. Most of them are small in size. As you get to larger ones, they're fewer and fewer on the landscape. They hold water, but not all year. This is the same site during the dry season. In a wet year, they might hold water 6 or 7 months. And in a dry year, they might only hold water in the wintertime. This is a cypress dome from the Florida Panhandle area. Again, relatively short hydro periods. They're all precipitation fed. As Sarah said, they lack permanent surface water connections to true waters of the U.S., rivers, streams, lakes, and estuaries. They're not all forested. They can be marshes and dominated by emergent vegetation. This is on karst landscape, and so this is a solution depression. As we go to the upper Midwest, the prairie potholes, again, important breeding ground for ducks. There's tens of thousands of these on the landscape up there. And as we get a little bit closer to Indiana, I can't quite see the whole slide, but this is from Newton County, not far from Morocco in northwest Indiana. And our remaining depressional wetlands a lot of them are sedge meadows like this. You go 20 miles west, just across the Illinois line into Kankakee County, and we're just south of the Kankakee River. This is a really large depressional wetland, another sedge meadow, and this has actually been protected as a wildlife management area by the state of Illinois. Of course, as we all know, there are a lot more of these on the landscape in the past, and so many of them have been converted to corn and soybeans. All right, I'm going to show 2 slides, conceptual slides, and they come out of a workshop from about 5 years ago and that I participated in. And this is a paper by Matt Cohen. And so I want to start at the top of the slide up here. View these blue lines as a watershed, and the upper lines are the headwater streams, and they coalesce into a larger second order stream as you move down the watershed, and then eventually a third order stream. And we have 3 saucers in this graph. This green saucer would be considered the waters of the U.S. It's in the floodplain and it's connected to the channel. It would have frequent or persistent surface connectivity reflected by the solid blue line here. There can be groundwater connections as well. But as we all know, the Clean Water Act really just deals with surface water, does not address the groundwater connections. But these type of wetlands would have very short travel time from the distance from where the water is in the wetland to the stream. So it doesn't stay in the wetland very long. It has very short travel time. All right, we go over here to this yellow saucer, and this would be an isolated wetland. It's not channel connected. It might have intermittent or infrequent surface flow during a period of heavy rain. It's further from the stream, could have groundwater connections as well. Well, the travel time for this, the time it takes water to make it from the wetland to the stream, is quite a bit longer. And of course, the functions are going to be different depending on the travel times. And then this third red wetland is another isolated wetland, but it's far removed from the actual stream or the river. And so surface connections may not be present. They may be absent or very infrequent. But again, groundwater connections are possible to likely. And of course, travel times for a wetland like this, which lacks those surface connections, is very long. It's going to take a long time for that water to make it to the stream. If we go down to figure B here, the green wetlands, the channel connected wetlands, they're important in basically modulating flood flows downstream, reducing the size and the duration of the flood pulse. And during dry periods, it could provide base flow to sort of maintain a minimum flow in that river or stream. Again, a short travel time. All right, these isolated wetlands that are a little further away on the landscape, infrequent connections, longer travel times, there could be important for sediment and phosphorus retention, denitrification, because they hold the water longer. They also could be important in providing some recharge to groundwater, and also they could be important refugia, basically an oasis on a dry landscape. And then the red wetland, the isolated wetland that's the farthest away and really lacks the least connections and has the longest travel time, they would be important in things like regulating groundwater recharge and solute regulation, which in this case could be reducing nitrate loading to groundwater, which is a problem in a lot of areas. The second cartoon graph comes out of a bioscience paper from the same workshop, and I really just want to focus on nitrogen here on the left side, and I'll touch base on phosphorus. But these are isoplests of nitrogen removal, from low rates of removal down here on the origin of the axis to very high rates of removal up at the top right-hand side. And that nitrogen removal is a function of two things: the position of the wetland and its residence time on the y-axis. Connected wetlands have short residence time. Isolated wetlands have a longer residence time. Great longer opportunity to remove pollutants. And then on the y-axis, this is really a wetland size function. The channel connected wetlands tend to be larger and not have a lot of edge to them. But as you get to isolated wetlands, they're increasingly small in size and have a lot of edge. So the combination of long retention and residence times and lots of edge to intercept nutrients and pollutants makes these in many respects pretty effective at removing these types of compounds. So under high rates of nitrogen removal, these small isolated wetlands, and remember, there can be thousands of these on the landscape, their plant uptake, high denitrification, and of course that can lead to lower nitrate export to downstream waters. The phosphorus story is similar. Again, smaller isolated wetlands can be important for phosphorus removal through a different combination of mechanisms, sedimentation, sorption, but also plant uptake. I think to kind of take this back to the nice sedge meadow in Kankakee County, Illinois, isolated wetlands, they're small, they're numerous, but the fact that they have longer retention and travel times in these surface connected wetlands, they can be important in groundwater recharge. Because they're smaller and have a lot of edge to them relative to surface volume, they can have high rates of sediment and nutrient removal. And of course, that means less export to downstream waters. And then last but not least, the fact that they're hydrologically isolated is important for amphibians because these things are small and they often don't have resident predators. They don't have permanent fish populations because they dry out. And so they end up being really important breeding grounds for herpetofauna. And I believe the next group of speakers is going to kind of go into detail on each of these. And I would ask Sarah that if any questions pop up, why don't you just repeat them to me, because I don't love technology. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, great. That was awesome, Chris. Thank you so much. There's been a couple questions. We do have time for just a couple of them. So first question, if we think about these retention times, why do isolated wetlands, these small wetlands with lots of edge, why are their travel times longer? Why do they have longer travel times and longer residence times?
Well, I mean, if they don't have surface water connections, what water they have is not going to get there very quickly. It's only going to be through groundwater. Of course, groundwater travel times are a lot longer than surface water travel times. So I think proportionally more of the water from these things is going through groundwater, and travel time is going to be a function of distance from the river, stream, or lake, and it's going to be a function of what proportion is going through groundwater. And as Bob will probably talk about, texture and the presence or absence of karst play a role in some of these things.
So the water has to infiltrate entirely through all of the groundwater before it reaches there. So it takes a long time.
Well, not entirely. You get a heavy, a wet spring, there's going to be some surface connections with some of those.
Very diverse flow paths, important. So if you were to pick, would you say isolated wetlands or connected wetlands are the most reactive for water quality improvements?
I think I would hedge on that answer, because my answer to that would be, a wetland has to be positioned in the landscape to intercept that material. And so isolated wetlands surrounded by agriculture are uniquely positioned to do that. But then wetlands, surface connected wetlands on rivers and streams are, they're seeing, every time the stream comes out of its banks, they're seeing sediment and nutrients. So I think it's not an either or answer. I think it's sort of the position within the landscape. A forested landscape, those surface connected wetlands aren't going to be removing a lot of nutrients because there aren't a lot of nutrients coming down the stream.
Great. I always love the it depends answer. That's pretty appropriate. Thanks, Chris. That was awesome.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's move on to our next speaker. Next up, we have Katie O'Reilly. Katie is a PhD candidate studying wetland ecology at the University of Notre Dame. Today, she's going to share with us the capacity for wetlands to act as nature's filter and improve water quality. Katie, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to you about some of our hardest working ecosystems, especially when it comes to ensuring we have clean water, and that's wetlands. In fact, you might even call them nature's Brita filters for the amount of hard work that they do. And so clean water, as we know, is not just important for human health, it's important for the health of our communities and for our economy. And so ensuring that there is clean water upstream, is important for ensuring the safety and sustainability of communities downstream. Unfortunately, thanks to land use changes that we've made, like increasing urbanization, there's often high levels of a variety of different contaminants that get kind of swept into our drinking water. This can be everything from excessive nutrients from the landscape, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, to other types of contaminants such as heavy metals, different organic compounds, things that run off, when we get a big rainstorm and they, sweep the parking lot. And so these changes to land use don't just impact us, on a very local scale. For example, the changes to agricultural land use that have happened in the Midwest actually have downstream effects to the Gulf of Mexico. There's a dead zone, which is a zone of really low to no oxygen that forms as a result of this nutrient runoff that gets kind of funneled down to the Gulf. And this has huge economic impacts for residents of the Gulf. So it's not just a local issue, it can be at a continental scale. And a little closer to home, we've seen that excessive nutrients that run off the landscape can cause algae blooms, for example, in the western basin of Lake Erie. Notably, back in 2014, there was a algae bloom that knocked out the water supply for the nearly 500,000 residents of Toledo, Ohio, my hometown. And one of the kind of thoughts behind that was like the fact that these nutrients were running from the surrounding landscape and not getting intercepted. So these are obviously very big problems. If we're talking at a continental scale, we've got a big issue, but luckily we've got a big kind of, hero to the rescue, and that is wetlands and their ability to improve water quality. And so when we talk about how wetlands actually do this, we're talking about a variety of different physical, chemical, and biological processes that actually remove these contaminants. And so to think about it, I like to think of wetlands as being really good at doing what I call 3 R's. And that is removing nutrients from the that come off the landscape, retaining sediments, and ridding or get rid of contaminants. That one doesn't super work with the R, but you get the point. And we kind of say wetlands do this, but it's really thanks to kind of two unlikely superheroes within the wetland that are doing a lot of this water quality improvement. And, they may not be as charismatic as some of the wetland creatures you'll hear about later today, but they are, perhaps even more hardworking. And that's wetland plants, things like cattails, as well as microbes, bacteria that live in the wetland. And so I'll kind of talk about how each of these players really helps improve our water quality. And so kind of the biggest, one of the biggest aspects of this water quality improvement is the physical process of slowing the water down. And so when you think about things like cattails, emergent vegetation, kind of their structure just slows the flow of water, increasing what we call residence time, or how much time water spends in a spot. It's supposed to move. Apologies. Let me see if I can get that to, again, technology is great, except when it doesn't work. Okay, let me reshare my screen. We'll see if this works. Okay, so as plants slowed the flow of water, they're actually allowing sediment and the things that are attached to settle out. One way that you can think about it is, if you imagine a salad dressing that's got a bunch of herbs and spices in it, if you give it a good shake, all of those herbs and spices get kind of suspended. But if you let the bottle kind of sit for a bit, those herbs and spices settle out. And it's the same concept when you're letting water settle out within a wetland. And because the sediment is able to settle out, you're also allowing things to settle and kind of retain that attach to the sediment, things like phosphorus or metals. And it's been estimated that a loss of the isolated wetlands within the prairie pothole region, kind of central US, Canada, has resulted in an increase of anywhere from 5 to 150 million tons of sediment entering surface waters each year, which is just an insane amount. And so these wetlands, physically hold back sediments, but also the plants that are within the wetlands biologically remove things like nutrients by taking them up and using them within their tissues to grow. So they store excess nutrients. And the plants actually kind of partner with the microbes in improving water quality because they create conditions within the wetland that promote microbial activity. They, by slowing the water's lower oxygen, which are conditions that microbes just love. And these microbes are actually doing this kind of biological chemical process that's called denitrification, which is where they convert nitrates, a form of nitrogen that usually comes in from the landscape, it's in fertilizers, and they convert it into nitrogen gas and release it to the atmosphere. And our air is 80% nitrogen, so it's a harmless gas, but you're basically transforming this nutrient that would potentially go downstream, cause an algal bloom or human health impacts, and you're converting it into a gas that gets exported into the air. And so kind of all wetlands have water quality impacts, as Chris kind of mentioned, but to really spotlight isolated wetlands, they are kind of the first line of defense when it comes to helping improve water quality. And this is due in part to their abundance. There's just a lot of them, even if they're kind of small in size, and their position in the landscape. They might be located in, near agricultural fields. So essentially what's happening is they're receiving the first flush of, water sediments from the surrounding landscape. And it's in a sense kind of creating these deposition and retention hotspots. So they may be small, but they're mighty in terms of what water quality improvements they can provide us. And actually, as they say, imitation is the highest form of flattery, and that's true with wetlands as well. Natural wetlands are so good at doing this water quality improvement that we often try and replicate some of their functions by constructing artificial wetlands for the purpose of treating wastewater. So the figure you kind of see in the top right corner is kind of a, how do we make cattails do the hard work of purifying water for us? And then, these are actually really attractive because the construction cost of an artificial wetland are typically a lot lower than conventional treatment systems, and they have lower operating costs than some of these traditional treatments. So, natural wetlands are so good that we try and capture a little bit of their power. And so I'll leave you with a couple of, either taking home points, or if you're at home, staying at home points. But really to remember is wetlands are really great at removing excess nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus from the landscape, which prevents nutrient pollution downstream. They retain sediments and harmful contaminants such as metals or pesticides, just because they slow down the water that allows these sediments to kind of settle out. And wetlands are some of our best and most cost-effective defenses against water pollution. And so with that, if there's any time, I can take a few questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. That was fantastic. I loved all the cartoons. I do have a couple questions. The first one is, can you touch on how much more effective wetlands are than stormwater detention wetlands? So maybe like a wet pond even. This bill is being backed by developers, and they often consider a wetland that's a stormwater basin can be a replacement for these natural wetlands that we're losing.
No, that's a great point. And I think, that kind of gets into where we have these artificial wetlands. They aren't quite as good as natural wetlands, and that's because wetlands are sort of more than the sum of their part, like they're greater than the sum of their parts. And the plants and the microbes are working in tandem together, but you also have other players. You have animals that contribute to some of these biogeochemical processes. And so it's kind of a, you're only getting pieces of the puzzle that may not work as effectively when you have an intact ecosystem where all of the pieces kind of play a role.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also add that many constructed wetlands are built on soils that are not formerly wetland soils. So they're compacted quite tightly in the bottom, so we don't have the same infiltration rates to groundwater that we might have in a natural wetland. We don't have the same microbial community, and we don't maybe have the same kind of wetland plant community because there's not that seed bank there. So it becomes a much more simplified ecosystem. And so to underscore Katie's point, all these little pieces aren't working at their 100% effectiveness. They're maybe working at half function maybe. And when you start to aggregate that, you lose a lot of total function around a watershed, let's say. So one more quick question, and then we'll move on while we're getting to the next speaker. Questions about what happens seasonally? How well do they work in the winter when the plants are dormant?
That is an excellent question. There are a lot of changes seasonally because even high temperatures help promote some of that microbial activity in the summer. So in the summer, wetlands are just churning in terms of like their reactivity, like turning these nutrients. It's less so in the winter because, as you said, Sarah, the plants are dormant. They're not necessarily growing as much, but there is still, there can be that physical structure of the plants that's still there, even if they're, it's piles of stuff. And that's the physical part that's slowing down the water and just allowing stuff to settle out, even if it's not necessarily churning as much as it might in the heat of the summer.
Yeah. Microbes are alive and well. They're just maybe a little slower.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. That was fantastic. Let's go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Up next is Bob Barr. Bob is a research scientist at IUPUI. He's a fluvial geomorphologist and a hydrologist who's worked extensively on managing rivers, streams, and wetlands in Indiana. He's going to share with us today the role that wetlands play in reducing the impacts of flooding and erosion. Take it away, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here today. It is a privilege. I don't know about following Chris and Katie because they had a lot better pictures than I'm going to have, but we'll do our best with storage. Chris introduced the idea of storage when he started talking about the buckets, the different areas that hold water in the watershed. And I'm going to take that and continue it a little bit further. And I want to tell you why we're so concerned with storage right now. The figure that you're looking at is measured data. So this isn't a model, this is measured data from 1895 to the present. And you see a consistent increase in received precipitation. So more water coming in, more potential runoff, more water going into the stream adds up to more flooding. And we've certainly seen that around the state. Now, there's also, if you'll notice, a second little axis here, and you'll see that the increase in rainfall has actually increased dramatically recently. So now the rains are coming even faster. And not only are they coming faster, they're coming with a greater intensity. So these are, again, measured data looking at the turn of the last century, 1900 through the present. You can see a steady increase in the number of extreme precipitation events. So more water faster than before. Again, more runoff, and as we frequently see, and less infiltration. So faster moving water, more flooding once again. So storage becomes critical. Now, the precipitation that we're receiving isn't received in the same amount around the state. The increase isn't the same. So you can see up here in the far northeastern part of the state, we've only had about a 4.5 inch increase in rainfall. But that's caused an increase in discharge and an increase in the way those streams flood. And that's going to be a good place to kind of look and show you how we can see the differences in a stream system that has wetlands functioning and stream systems that don't have the same amount of wetlands functioning. And we'll take a look at that. Now, before we get to that example, I want to emphasize the point that what we're seeing is statewide. This is an example from Kankakee River at Shelby, Indiana. This is February 2019, and you can see that we are up on the banks, the docks are floating, we're going up into the yards. We can see very little room left under the bridge. And this is in the far northwestern corner of the state. If we go down to the southeastern part of the state, same time, same year, we see the aftermath of another flood. Both of these are fairly large flood events, and they've affected the community. In this particular image at Whitewater, before this storm, the river was on this side of the power pole. Now it's completely shifted and moved over and is moving into some of the historic structures in Metamora. Now, to look at the difference though, and understand the difference wetland makes, we needed to look at two watersheds, two stream systems that are essentially in the same part of the state. So we picked some sites where we've been doing some work lately. These are two tributaries to the Maumee River, and since they form the Maumee, the St. Joseph River coming down from the northeast, and the St. Mary's River coming up from the southeast. And both of these come together in Fort Wayne. Maumee then flows down towards the Western Lake Erie Basin. And as Katie said, they've had problems there for years. So we've been looking at these two rivers to see how they behave. Notice that there, you can see at the bottom, the drainage areas are essentially the same. Basin areas and shape are essentially the same. So this is as close we can get to a nice match set as possible, but there are some differences. So this is a hydrograph. This is a graph of water moving past a certain point in the river to let us know how much water is flowing through here. And on it, you'll see two trend lines, one linear and one here moving average, a 10-year moving average, to kind of smooth out a little of the noise in this data. Whenever you've got really high peaks and really low lows, a linear trend is not always the best way to look at it. Sometimes we can see a little more with the moving average. Regardless, what's important here is to see the steady increase in peak discharge. And you see that over the course of record from 1933 to present, what we've done is we've increased the peak discharge on the St. Mary's by about 25%. So 25% increase means 25% more water coming past there and more water coming in there at the time of flood. So big floods like this aren't our normal concern. They're a challenge, but honestly, wetlands alone aren't going to get rid of big floods. They can reduce that peak, but they're not going to get rid of a big flood. And big floods are caused by regional storms and regional precipitation and a lot more water than the system can handle. But what we can do with depressional wetlands, with isolated wetlands, is we can reduce the number of 1 to 2 year flood events. So smaller floods, the floods that cause most of the erosion, the floods that actually cause us most of the problems in the local communities on a, like I said, annual basis. Well, here's a frequency of bankful discharge for the same point, St. Mary's River at Decatur. And you see we've had a significant increase in the number of bankful events. They almost mirror the increase we've seen in precipitation, which makes sense because the St. Mary's is very much a runoff-driven river. The wetlands have been disconnected. What depressions we had have been smoothed out. They've been tiled. The system has been drained. So what you're seeing is a response to the increase in rainfall. Compare that with the St. Joseph River. Remember, same size, same shape, but in the St. Joseph, we don't really see the same trend. Notice that the peak discharge in the St. Joseph hasn't gone up as much. You can see an increase of about 20% if you look at the linear average. But as I said, look at the moving average on this one. It hasn't changed. Statistically, it's the same. You're seeing a groundwater-driven river, a wetland-supported river, not responding precipitation in the same way. So what is a problem to us in a runoff-driven system doesn't appear in this wetland system. Consider this. Here's the bankful events. No change. 1947 to present, there have been no substantive changes in the way this river is flooding. So that's what the wetlands can do for us. They can actually help buffer the flooding that we're seeing. Now, I have some key points as well. Total annual precipitation is increasing, which means that runoff is going to increase. Increased runoff is going to lead to increased flooding and decreased infiltration. And if we lose the state regulated isolated wetlands, we will see an increase in flooding and a decrease in infiltration. Now, this becomes significant for a couple of reasons. We want to manage our flooding better. Flooding has continued to go up, but we also want to do something about storage, the infiltration aspect, the recharge of the groundwater. Because one of the signatures of the climate change that we're experiencing right now is an increase in variability. We have lots of heavy rains, we have rain on snow, big floods, and then no precipitation in the summer months. So we're going to be in a time of floods and droughts, and wetlands can help us with both, and we don't have enough to lose. Thanks for your time. Any questions?
Thanks, Bob. There are a couple questions that have popped up. I'll give you, the first one is relatively short, but it might be one of the harder questions. Do we have a good understanding of the percent of wetlands that have been removed from the St. Mary's versus the St. Joseph River?
That is an excellent question. And we don't have a good idea of the percent. We know that most of the ones in St. Mary's were located on the till plain. And so what we call them in central till plain are Brookston depressional wetlands. And again, like Sarah was talking about and Katie referenced, these are a series of depressions on the landscape, very small depressions. But as rain is received, as rainfall increases, they fill up and they connect. Mm-hmm. So while they're geographically isolated from each other, they will, and we have some wonderful preliminary work in Hamilton County showing one of these basins filling up and seeing the water spill off of it into the stream. They're isolated to a point, but with more rainfall, we don't see that. those wetlands were very easy to get rid of with the tiling. And I'm afraid we could, it's a good project. We could figure that out.
Great.
Always
I
more
also
work
have-
to do. Thanks,
Always
Sarah.
more work to do. One more quick question and then we'll move on. If you had to pick in a watershed such as the St. Mary's, where it's precipitation driven and you were, or even restoring wetlands that were formerly there, would they be better if they were scattered around the watershed, kind of like sprinkles on the top of your, cupcake, or if they were, isolated, or I'm not using that word, concentrated at maybe the outlet of the watershed or on different parts? Like, what would you suggest would be the most effective way of reducing flooding?
It's a good question. I would start off by trying to put them back where they used to be in many places, which is in the headwaters of these systems. I mean, that's always my starting point. We're not going to control flooding downstream. So we have to work upstream. And in most Indiana rivers, if you walk far enough upstream, you end up in wetlands, which is why fluvial geomorphologists like myself actually spend a lot of time in wetlands, because you want to find out where the water is coming from, how the water is getting into the stream. And in most places, it is a wetland complex. I would start out there. The next thing I would do is, one of the things we have to do to start reducing flooding is to start reattaching floodplains. They're there for a reason. The river put them in there for a reason. The river needs them, and we've taken them away. So we have the flooding as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank
I'll
you so
stop
much.
sharing.
Thank you so much. That was great. Our next speaker is Dr. Cliff Johnston. He's a professor at Purdue University. Dr. Johnston is a soil scientist with over 30 years of experience working on carbon dynamics in agricultural and wetland soils. Today, he's going to share with us how important wetlands are for storing carbon. So, Cliff, if you are ready, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to present this afternoon and just talk briefly about carbon storage in wetlands. And so I am going to provide a little bit of perspective in general about the wetlands in Indiana and carbon storage. And then I'll also talk specifically about some research that we've done in northern Indiana, in fact, right in the middle of the Grand Marsh, former wetland, in terms of and its importance in the landscape. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about the importance of...
Cliff, sorry to interrupt you, but we aren't seeing your screen slide on your slides, so you might
It
want to...
says that I'm sharing it. Let's see. Okay, hang on. Sorry.
If you need to, Robbie can share for us if we need to.
See, I got it.
Okay, great. Looks like it's going
Hang
now.
on. As Katie said, technology is great, except when it doesn't work. Okay, is that working?
You're good.
Good. All right. So yeah, so just talk a bit about the importance of storing carbon in soils. And so one thing to point out is that agriculture plays an important role in the fight against climate change. And just a couple facts here about: there's 3 times more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere, and there's 1.5 times more carbon in the soil than in the atmosphere and above ground plant biomass combined. And so one of the current terms and areas of interest in soils is what we're calling the critical zone, and that's where rocks meet life. And wetlands are certainly an important role, as they have the capacity to store carbon, but conversely, disturbed wetlands represent a major source of overall carbon emissions. So one aspect that's interesting now is that this idea of that more Indiana farmers are getting on board with carbon sequestration payment ideas. And this is the idea of adopting, let's say, climate-friendly practices, that is, using no-till or cover crops and other practices that are going to help to build up a carbon which is in the soil and rewarding farmers for participating in those efforts. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. One of the ways of thinking about carbon in soils is this idea about identifying what we call the carbon stock. And a carbon stock is simply the amount of carbon that is present down to a specified depth. So you could think of, if we just have, let's say, 1 cubic meter here, would be the amount of carbon that was stored in that. So 1 square meter on the surface, and going down to a depth of looking at the amount of carbon. And if we look at, let's say, mineral soils, when you're driving down I-65 and you look at, let's say, the soil, bare soil, and you might see darker or lighter colored areas, the amount of carbon that's present in those soils is maybe on the order of 17 or kilograms of carbon per meter squared, down to, in a lighter colored soil, to 13. And so we'll come back and use this as a frame of reference for looking at that. So one of the things, just again, talking about soils, we'll talk about wetlands here in just a minute, is this idea about what happens when we change cultivation practices. So we can think of our, let's say, our prairie soils here in northern Indiana. We had a starting carbon content that was higher. We introduced cultivation, plowing the soil, breaking up soil structure, oxygen diffusing into the soil. And those microorganisms that Katie was talking about also serve the role of degrading soil organic matter. And so what happens is that the overall carbon content in the soil is decreased. And then with management change, let's say adopting a practice like no-till, we can in fact begin to build carbon back up into the soil. And so this data is, there's been a number of studies out there to be able to look at it. We're fortunate to have one such study located here at Purdue by Professor Tony Vine's research group. And this was looking at our agronomy research farm. And again, just in terms of carbon stock, let's say the initial carbon stock for this soil was, let's say, 22. After conventional tillage, after 28 years, the carbon content had decreased down to 15.9. And then with the adoption of no-till, we can increase that up to 16.9. So this is, basically, this is a scientific study where these numbers have been replicated, et cetera. But what I want to point out is that this is over a period of 28 years. And so if we look at that, it's what are the takeaways? One is that carbon is slowly preserved in soils when we adopt conservation practices. However, the amount of carbon increases a modest amount, maybe 0.04 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. And this gets back to Senate Bill 373, this idea about being able to reward farmers for adopting these climate-friendly practices. And so this is definitely a good thing. So what about wetlands? So what is the carbon stock in wetland soils? And so, of course, yeah, the answer we've already thrown out there today is that it depends. But there's, on average, maybe 5 to 10 times more carbon in a wetland soil than in a mineral cropland soil. And there's been a study that was conducted a few years back. It was called the Indiana Carbon Storage Project, where they looked at this. And so, without going into great details, found that mineral soils can, in fact, sequester a modest amount of carbon, maybe 0.02 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. However, these drained wetland soils have the potential to release significant amounts of carbon to the atmosphere, on the order of minus 0.8 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. So a differential of 40 times. So we've actually done research up in this area, up in the Grand Marsh, former wetland site, and looking at a study that was conducted over the period of about half of a year. I won't go into the particulars, but these are actually difficult measurements to do, to be able to quantify the amount of carbon which is being lost. And the results from this is on the order of what are the data that I've shown here. So we used several different measurement technologies, and they were all reasonably consistent in terms of the amount of carbon that's being lost from this drained wetland soil. And one point that I'd like to make here is that this is not new information. This has been known for a long time. These are, for example, some historic pictures from the Florida Everglades, where subsidence of those organic soils down there is subsiding at the rate of about 3 centimeters per year. In fact, measurements here in Indiana are comparable. And so this is the result of draining these wetland soils. There's a lot of organic matter. As we drain the soils, the oxygen diffuses into the soil and we begin to decompose that. And so just to be able to put that in perspective, so in our Indiana cropland, we have about 12.6 million acres of, let's say, mineral soil cropland. And over time, the data that I presented earlier, we have, let's say, from after cultivation and adopting climate-friendly practices like no-till and cover crops, we can increase that a modest amount. However, the cost of draining wetlands is huge in terms of the amount of carbon, the carbon stock that is here over that same period. This is the amount of carbon that is lost, going from 90 to 64 as opposed to the increase to 15.9 to 17. So this is really, this is a problem. The story doesn't have to stop there, because instead of obviously of being able to preserve these wetlands, that the upside potential of having a place to be able to store carbon is there as well. Because as it turns out, wetlands are really a great place to be able to store carbon. And so just in summary, a couple points here. Wetlands contain up to about 7 times more carbon on a per area basis than mineral soils. These drained wetland soils release carbon about 40 times faster than carbon can be stored through conservation practices. And even though wetlands and wetland soils, they account for only a minor part of our agricultural landscape, they're a dominant part of the carbon budget. And so just a couple ideas here. It's estimated that we store about 1.2 million tons of carbon in 12.6 million acres, but we lose 0.7 million acres in that same period of time. And so wetlands really, it's sort of it's a great opportunity to be able to store carbon, but there's a downside potential of being able to release significant amounts of carbon. So thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Cliff. That was great. Could you put your last screen up again, just so that we can see your take-home point?
I thought somebody cut me off. That's what I thought happened.
Oh no, I think maybe it advanced or something, and it.
Yeah.
There
Sorry
you go.
about that. Oh,
You're
okay.
good.
Yeah.
So we have had a couple questions come in, and some of them are really detailed and fascinating, and some are a little, if we don't get to all of them, will be posted over to Slack. But I did want to ask, there's a stat posted in the chat about EPA's greenhouse gas emissions inventory recently estimated that U.S. wetlands, those converted and remaining, make up only about 0.5% of all the carbon stock on land. Do you think that's still where we're at? Or do you think we have a better understanding of that number?
Can you?
It's in the chat if you want to look at it yourself
yeah.
too. But yeah, so carbon in wetlands is only about 0.42% of all the carbon in the landscape.
I don't believe that is, I don't think that's accurate. I'll have to look at that and give a more detailed response. Whoever asked the question, I'd be glad to follow up with and be able to respond to that. But there, I would just sort of point out this statistic here, this fifth bullet here, that, oh man, if we look at the carbon, which is there, that, in our 12 million acres, we can store about 1.2 million tons of carbon. So there's a significant amount of carbon that is present in wetlands. And so this is, it's an opportunity to store more carbon, or it's an opportunity to lose carbon. So, yeah.
I think that's a great point to underscore. And there's some conversations going on in Slack about the bioavailability of this carbon. So we will continue that discussion over there. I think there's, as we all probably know or can relate to, not all carbon is created equal. And wetlands are particularly good at keeping carbon stored versus letting it decompose. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I apologize to the group today for some of the technical glitches, but I'm glad to follow up with anyone on that.
Oh, you're fine. It's kind of been par for the course, as they say. Thanks so much, Cliff. If you could stop sharing, we'll go on to our next and final speaker. Last but not least, we have Dr. Jason Hoverman. Dr. Hoverman is a professor at Purdue University. He's an aquatic ecologist whose talk today will show us the diversity of wetland habitats and wetland creatures in Indiana's wetlands. Jason, the floor is yours. And if you're speaking, you mute it. There you go. Yep, you're good.
You can see the screen. You guys are good? All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So my goal today is to introduce you to some of the wildlife species that utilize these wetland habitats all across Indiana. And I'll also note that I'll use a very broad definition of wildlife. So I'll include both invertebrate as well as vertebrate species today. Okay, so as you've seen in some of the talks previously, wetlands are very diverse ecosystems, and you've seen lots of different terms kind of thrown out there. You'll see swamp, slough, prairie potholes, all the way down to vernal pools. So these are very diverse ecosystems. And what's amazing about this diversity is it generates diversity in the species that utilize these wetlands as well. So this includes both plants as well as animals. And again, I'm going to focus mainly on the wildlife today. But we have species that are completely dependent on these wetland habitats, so they spend their entire lives within these habitats, and then those that just occasionally come down and utilize these habitats. So what I want to do now is just start off at the invertebrate level. And with invertebrates, these are a broad diversity of species that utilize these wetland habitats, and again, they often go overlooked. You know, a lot of people aren't kind of focusing on the invertebrate species, you know, not necessarily the most charismatic species. But just give you a few examples of this. So we have things like freshwater snails, right? They're one of the dominant consumers in these systems, consuming algae, detritus. We could also look at some of the predatory species. So what you see here is a Lithoceros, or also called a toe biter. This is a predaceous diving beetle right here, a larval form of that. And then over here is a dragonfly larva. And if you're a fan of sci-fi films, you've probably noticed these kind of forms and features. I think they really kind of feed off of that for some of the movies out there. But what's really amazing, they are dominant predators in these systems. They consume fish, amphibians, as well as other invertebrates. Many of these species also metamorphose and come up on land. So dragonflies are a great example. So they're then flying around your head, consuming things like mosquitoes and other invertebrates. Damselflies kind of fit that category as well. And then we also have species that rest at that interface between the water and the land. So we have things like water striders and fishing spiders. So again, broad diversity of invertebrate species utilizing these habitats. And I'll touch more on the importance of that a little later on when we get to some of the mammal species as well. Okay, so I also want to talk about some of the vernal pool invertebrates. So I found a video from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies that I thought was really kind of cool to show you guys. So this is showing you some of the invertebrates that live in these very ephemeral pools. So they dry every year. So the species in these habitats, oftentimes they lay resting eggs, and as soon as that pond fills in the springtime, they all hatch out. So what you're seeing in this video are things like fairy shrimp right here. You'll see some Daphnia, as well as copepods. Those are zooplankton, very broadly categorized. But what's really amazing about these species is just how diverse, again, they are in these very ephemeral habitats. They dry every year and they start anew every spring. So again, I highly encourage you guys to go visit this website. It's got some great videos of vernal pool habitats. Okay, now let's shift over and talk about some of the vertebrate species. So I am working on amphibians. So this is kind of near and dear to my heart. This is a wood frog here. Now we're seeing some of the snow melt in the state because of the huge snowstorm that we had last week. You'll start to see these guys probably emerge in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully this video will work. This is a video of breeding males in a vernal pool. All those little ripples are male wood frogs. And they kind of sound like ducks, but they are wood frogs. But again, these ephemeral habitats come alive with amphibian biodiversity in the springtime. Another one of my favorite amphibian species is the American toad, and this one might blow your ears away a little bit. These guys are actually very bold callers. Amphibian species will actually call during the daytime. And the reason for that is they have these very large parotid glands or poison glands on the back of their head, so predators tend to avoid them. But as a consequence, they can be very bold out there and calling. And then probably my favorite amphibian species in the state is the gray tree frog. Here's a male calling for you. In the background, you can hear spring peepers as well. One more call. And that's my son, who's out there collecting with me. But yeah, so these guys start calling about May, and then it'll last until the about middle of July or so. Okay, so in addition to frogs and toads, we also have a diversity of salamanders who use these wetland habitats. This is the marbled salamander. This here is the tiger salamander. So both these types of species, they lay their eggs in these aquatic environments, they hatch out, and as larvae, they often become the top predator. So they're consuming things, again, like other amphibians and invertebrates in these habitats. And they can largely fill that role because fish are largely excluded from many of these isolated wetlands. So again, they become that dominant predator. Another, what I find charismatic species, this is the red-spotted newt. So again, they have a larval stage, they metamorphose and come up on land into this F stage. And again, this F stage is actually relatively toxic, but what they're doing is searching out for other wetlands, and as adults, they'll actually spend the rest of their lives in those wetlands when they come back and will breed in those wetlands. Now for amphibians, we also have a number of amphibians that are in trouble. So things like the northern cricket frog, blue-spotted salamander are listed as species of concern in the state. This is the plains leopard frog, crawfish frog, and the mole salamander are all listed as state endangered. So again, these ephemeral habitats, these wetland habitats, are critical for sustaining populations of these amphibian species in the state of Indiana. Now let's move over to reptiles. Again, diversity of species here that utilize wetland habitats. You often see turtles, such as the painted turtle, using these wetland environments. Another common species is the common snapping turtle, often coming up on land. You'll see them dispersing in July or so and going to their breeding sites. Again, they're utilizing these wetland habitats for most of their lives. And then you have the northern water snake. So a variety of snake species, but this snake in particular is highly specialized to, obviously, aquatic habitats such as wetlands. And just like the amphibians, we have a number of reptile species that are in trouble as well. So this is the Kirtland snake, copper-bellied water snake, eastern mud turtle, spotted turtle, and Blanding's turtle. All 5 of these species are state endangered and critically associate with these wetland environments. So again, if we're not preserving these habitats, we're at risk of losing some of these species in our state. Okay, so from reptiles and amphibians, let's move over to birds. Again, we have a huge diversity of birds in the state of Indiana, and a lot of them associate with wetland environments. So I'm just going to show you a few of these. You've obviously probably seen great blue herons, just a majestic species out in there in these wetlands, consuming frogs, reptiles, fish, but again, very commonly seen. Waterfowl, obviously huge users of these wetlands. So ducks, geese, if you're a waterfowl hunter, you know that we need these high quality wetlands to sustain populations for these game species. And just like the other 2 groups, we have a number of species of concern. So this is the leaf spittern, this is the king rail, and the marsh wren, just to name a few species that are critically endangered in the state and highly depend on these aquatic environments to make their living. And then lastly, we could talk about things like wild turkey, right? Even though these species don't strongly associate with wetlands, they still need access to fresh, clean water to sustain their populations. Again, another game species that is importantly using these types of wetland habitats. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about are the mammal species that utilize these wetlands. You could obviously think about beaver. They're really unique in that they actually can create their own ecosystems, their aquatic systems, so their dams can actually create wetlands on their own. Muskrats, again, a wetland specialist. Often see their lodges in these wetlands, especially during the wintertime when they kind of stick out from the snow. The mink, another example, not very common in the state, but where we see the most likely encounters with them is by high quality freshwater systems such as marshes and swamps. And we also have a species, the swamp rabbit. This particular rabbit, again, highly associates with wetland environments, and again, is a species of concern in the state as well. And as I mentioned before, with the invertebrates, the invertebrate populations that emerge from these wetland habitats are critically important for things like bats. In the state of Indiana, most of our bats are listed in some way at the federal or state level. This is the Indiana bat. It's listed as federally endangered. And this species is using these wetland environments for foraging. So using those invertebrates that are emerging from these wetlands. So another key reason why we want to preserve these types of habitats. And then lastly, just kind of talk about some of the other species, things like white-tailed deer, red fox, bears, the charismatic kind of megafauna that people typically think about. You know, oftentimes you don't find them swimming around in a pond or a wetland, but again, they need access to fresh, clean water for their populations. So again, another motivation for saving these types of wetlands, especially as they get more isolated, they become more important for these wildlife species. So my take-home points for you today are these wetlands are very diverse ecosystems. They support a broad range of species. And then I think is most important here is that they're critical habitat for both threatened and endangered species that we have here in the state. Oop. Bring that back, sorry.
You're good. That was really fantastic. I hope you all enjoyed the virtual field trip we all just got to take with Jason. That was amazing. I know that I'm pretty excited to get out and see some of these frogs do their thing. So basically, there's several posts in the chat just basically thanking you for all of these beautiful photos. But I kind of wonder. Okay, hold on. Ooh. There's so many things. Okay, any estimate? Do we have any estimates? I know that we talked about this briefly before your talk, and we were chatting about the estimate of the acreage of these pools in Indiana. Do you have any sense of these small isolated vernal pools, what their area might be in Indiana now?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know, I mean, across the states, I think we're from the historic levels, we're at what, 95% loss of the total acreage. Somewhere around there, 85 to 95% that we've lost over time, but I'm not sure the exact acreage. Some of the other folks in the group might have a better estimate of that.
I think it's hard to measure because they're so seasonally changing, and it's a really difficult number to pin down. One other question came in. Can you talk a little bit about how frogs and other amphibians find these isolated wetlands?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of them kind of remember their natal site, so where they actually metamorphose from. So they have kind of the ability to recognize a lot of the cues that got them from that pond to go back and forth. Some will use moisture gradients, so they'll travel along the ground and follow that moisture gradient down to the wetland. There's some thought the species can actually smell the wetland as well, so there's chemical cues that come off of that. So the algae that's blooming in these habitats, they can actually sense that. So there's lots of ways they can navigate. They can actually use celestial cues as well. And there's some cases where they'll actually follow the sounds of other frogs calling as well. So there's lots of different mechanisms to help them find those habitats. But most amphibians, again, aren't dispersing large distances away from their natal ponds. They're within probably 1 kilometer or less of those sites. So they don't have that far to go to really get there. And that's, again, another reason why they're critical to preserve on the landscape, because if they're isolated, it's hard for them to find a new habitat because they're so far away from potentially other habitats that could be suitable.
Right, that speaks a lot to the connectivity idea of making sure if we have one of these, the sum is greater than its individual parts, right? Because as these little wetlands are connected to each other, then they support even larger populations. If they're isolated, really isolated, and there's not any other ones nearby, that has an even greater impact than on those communities. Someone asked a question about how we assess acreage or just surface area of one of these things. Do we typically use it as wetted perimeter, the surface actual standing water, or some sort of saturated soils?
Yeah, so oftentimes when we go out there and kind of get the overall size of a wetland, we try to do that in the springtime to get us the max extent of the kind of the wet area. And obviously, especially the vernal pools, they dry completely in the summertime, right? So they're gradually decrease in size. So you try to get out there early in the spring when they're kind of full to the max. And that's how you get kind of the main acreage of it at that time point.
Great. Cool. I think that that kind of, there's several questions that have popped up, and one of them was asking about, and Katie actually answered, which is great, about fish supporting these vernal pools supporting fish populations. So thanks for answering that, Katie. One last question. Generally, with regard to wetland plants, and maybe this could go back to any of our speakers, is there a significant problem with invasives? We had a comment in earlier that came into a private comment to me about cattails. And what are the ideas about invasives and the native vegetation? I'll make one small comment and then I'll turn it over to all of my distinguished colleagues. That microbial communities, they actually sometimes like these invasives better because they have more degradable carbon, or their roots are leakier and get out more nutrients to those microbial communities. So there is, from a microbial standpoint, the invasive species can often be positive, but not all the other functions that we're talking about. So maybe I'll start off with Jason and then pass it off to some others who want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, the invasive issue is huge. You know, things like purple loosestrife have invaded various places, and the problem is they become a monoculture. So it ends up, you end up reducing diversity. And especially in a wetland habitat, if that diversity is important for things like Katie was talking about, you know, you can lose some of that function of that ecosystem. So it's a substantial problem for wetlands in particular.
Katie or Cliff, would either of you like to speak to the microbial side and add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak as much to the microbial side, but I will just add that the invasive species are often a large problem, just because they, you know, it's a different community than what is naturally there. And, you know, one of the things we learn as ecologists is like you pull a string and, you know, everything is connected. So sometimes the unexpected kind of influences of a single change of a plant can have kind of reverberating effects overall. So that's not a very scientific, it's more philosophical, but like there's always unexpected things that happen, and particularly with invasives, like Sarah said, either, you know, maybe the microbes really love it, but then it influences the faunal community of a wetland. Mm-hmm. And then overall your ecosystem functioning decreases.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Gary Lamberti just posted a great comment in the chat that says, well, functioning wetlands are often more resistant to invasion than constructed wetlands. And I would just underscore that point if I could, because that is very true. Well, highly biodiverse wetlands also have a whole host of other services that are provided. They do not become the swamp down the hill that is full of mosquitoes. They have the predators for those mosquitoes, and all those things are working together. Cliff, I see that you unmuted. Did you want to share anything else?
I'll just point out, I think it's really, I think it's been emphasized today, it's very difficult to separate chemical processes from biological processes and even from hydrological processes. And so wetlands are sort of the convergence of all of those things. And so I like what Katie had about the role of microorganisms, and but just keep in mind that everything is coupled to everything else. And so all the chemical processes related to the ability to deal with nitrogen or phosphorus, or even the decomposition is basically, there's a very intimate connection between the microbial and the chemical processes in the soil, and it's all driven by water.
Great. I would certainly agree with all of those comments. And I just want to remind everybody that we are at our time here. We have just a couple minutes left. If there's any other questions, we can certainly answer those in the chat. But it's about 10 minutes-ish to the start of our policy forum, which is at 4:30. So I would just like to do another huge thank you to all of our speakers today. You guys did an amazing job of kind of highlighting a lot of the key aspects and the functions that wetlands provide, leaping them into all of the research that we do. And so I'm really grateful for your participation today, and I know everyone on the forum is as well. So there's been a couple questions about, hey, can you actually link in some of your more highly technical research papers into some of these? So for those of you nerds out there, like those of us on the call, we would love to do that, and we'll certainly figure out a way to make some of those resources available to folks.